All right, so we're going back to part two here of middle childhood. So in middle childhood, we do see kids' growth continue to slow down. It was fastest in prenatal, and then we'll see another jump in growth rate right before adolescence. We usually talk about that with adolescence. It's end of middle childhood, right before adolescence. Um, so at first, there's some age differences between girls and guys. Girls tend to be shorter and lighter than boys. Later, the switches. Has some to do with the earlier onset of puberty with girls than boys, and the androgens, the hormones that are engaged to begin the puberty changes in one's body um, are really good at fueling growth. So girls grow a little bit earlier than guys, but then we also tend to level out before guys do. Um, so the other thing that goes on in physical growth with middle childhood is that children's legs tend to grow a bit faster than their upper bodies. So those are clearly the legs of an adult man, but not, or an adult, not a kid. But that whole high waters thing, it is a thing. Kids' legs grow, their pants are likely to be too short for a little while. Um, because their legs are growing faster than the rest of their body. So this is also the physical body kind of lengthening out, which tends to happen in a growth spurt right before adolescence, right before puberty. Um, so there's the differences in kids who are getting regular and sufficient amounts of nutrition and who are healthy. The kid and those who are not, the height difference begins to be more apparent in middle childhood. Um, we also see that people are taller and heavier. We are bigger all around than we used to be in past and generations. And we also, because of this, puberty tends to be triggered earlier. Puberty is kind of the end of the physical growth that we talk about for middle childhood. An interesting aspect of middle childhood is that because the long bones of the body are growing longer and wider, the ligaments that attach those bones to muscles are struggling to keep up. This leads to kids being more flexible because their muscles are less strongly attached, less more flexibly attached to their bones, and kids also may experience growing pains or stiffness or acheness of their leg muscles in particular, but sometimes arms, as those muscles and ligaments are stretching to adapt to the growing skeleton. We also lose our baby teeth and get adult teeth in middle childhood. Around the world, this is one of the things that people associate with kids becoming more logical, becoming more responsible. It is a marker, kind of a milestone of development in other parts of the world and has been historically. Um, when kids are losing their teeth and getting adult teeth, we have new, more pressing problems with dental care. Not that you don't have to take care of your baby teeth at all. Anybody who knows a dentist out there, I didn't say you didn't have to brush your baby teeth. Brushing your teeth at any age is really important because even baby teeth can get uh, rotted enough to cause problems for your jawbone. But the adult teeth are the ones you're going to keep for the rest of your life. So things become a little bit more pressing, and as kids get their adult teeth, we also may have orthodontia issues because adult teeth tend to be bigger and they may not necessarily all fit very nicely in your jaw. So brain's getting bigger as well in middle childhood. Most of this is myelination and nerve fibers. We're continuing to do that pruning thing where we are losing neurons that are not used. They connections between parts of the brains that are not used weaken and then fall away. Um, there are some studies that suggest that brain development is also increased by the hormones that are androgens that are related to the growth spurt right before puberty. Okay, so kids are getting better with their gross motor development. They're much more flexible, balanced. They can do more accurate and quicker movements, and they're stronger. And we can see this in how they play. Um, whether kids play at these at group sports using these developments is going to be healthy or not has a lot to do with whether it's children focused or adult organized, and if it is adult organized, how healthy the adults have set that up to be. In some cases, kids can be overworked, and involvement in sports, child sports, can be a bad thing. Generally, it is a good thing. It may even have protective factors for young women in terms of body image. So fine motor development, we're getting better at writing. While early childhood, early elementary school kids tend to use bigger letters and write using their whole arm, so most of the movement is coming from the elbow or the shoulder even. Younger or the older kids are more able to use fine motor skills, so we're moving from writing using gross motor skills, right, to using fine motor skills. We also get better at drawing. Some of this is about the use of those fine motor skills. Some of this is about thinking about detail and perspective taking, planning as well. Another thing to consider in middle childhood is moral development. Here I'm talking about adolescence. So it is supported in adolescence. Kohlberg, who is the most often cited for this, started his work with younger kids, with middle childhood kids. One of the key ideas for Kohlberg was these dilemmas or situations where someone has to consider what is the correct thing to do. And in this Heinz dilemma, wife is dying of cancer. There's a drug that can save her, but he can't afford it. And Heinz tries to bargain with the local pharmacist to get a better price. The pharmacist won't lower the price. So Heinz breaks in and steals the drug. So this pits saving someone's life, which is a good thing to do, against obeying the law, which is a good thing to do. So he's breaking some moral code in one way or the other, regardless of what he does. So the question is, which of the two options the kids choose, and less so their choice, but how they explain that choice. And based on children's responses to dilemmas like the Heinz dilemmas, Kohlberg came up with several stages of moral development: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. The interesting thing here is that for those later stages, we don't seem to see them appear in terms of the percentage of people that are using those more complex moral systems until later in life. What we do see, and what I wanted to point out to you, is how much change is going on right around the beginning of this graph on the as far as the x-axis is concerned, right? Ages 10 to 14, this is right the beginning of middle childhood and going into adolescence. We have tons of changes. A drop off in stage 1. Stage 2 is pretty significant. There's a lot of folks that are using that second stage of moral development, but it's dropping off significantly. Stage 3 is skyrocketing. You get tons more stage 3. And stage 4 makes an appearance in the slowly increasing up until middle adulthood, right? So the point here is that kids are engaging more in their social worlds. They're using these logical and kind of problem solving skills that they now have um, more developed than they did in pre operations or in preschool, um, and starting to consider the world in more complex moral ways. Okay, so peer groups. Peer groups are groups that interact regularly, afford a sense of belonging, follow norms, shared values and behaviors, have a hierarchical organization. Um, Lots of peer groups in childhood, as in the rest of our lives, tend to share characteristics like gender, ethnicity, and popularity. Um, in middle childhood, kids tend to be in same gender cliques, although these same gender cliques may interact with other gender cliques, but they tend to be gender segregated. Um, and they're gender segregated not only in who they hang out with, but also what they're doing. So girls groups tend to talk about intimacy, sharing confidences, mutual support. Boys groups do stuff, um, activities, competitions, and they emphasize loyalty and doing things together. Um, Girls are more oriented towards accord and verbal or emotional intimacy than physically doing stuff together. Um, there's some concern generally about the interactions between genders in middle childhood because they're so segregated by gender and kids tend to self-segregate. Um, we see different patterns of behavior for different gendered groups. Girls tend to hang out in smaller groups and talk, while guys play or run around in larger swarms, larger groups of guys. There may be differences in the socio-emotional development that they're doing in these different activities, right? So some have proposed that in the larger groups, organizing activities with larger groups requires more negotiation, requires better planning, and so guys are working on those skills, whereas women may be working on establishing emotional and social intimacy. So we also see this heterosexual teasing and cross-gender chase games. So we talk about uh, boys against girls or girls against boys. Some of this may be related to adults in their lives, kind of marking those different groups and imitating that habit of separating by gender. Um, but research has suggested that these games are not so much about um, sexuality or flirting or chasing, trying to get someone from the opposite sex. This is more about marking social hierarchies. The popular kids would have more people chasing them. It also marks the boundaries between who are the boys and who are the girls. Um, and you will notice that when we move into adolescence and dating starts to happen uh, between individuals, that we no longer see these cross gender chasing games, right? They only work so long as we are considering cross gender contact as polluting, and once it's not so bad to be caught by a boy, then we don't play the game anymore. Also friendships. So thinking about friends, kids who have best friends, no matter how well accepted they are among other classmates or how popular they are, were reported being less lonely than those with best friends. Um, if we talk about sociometric ways of figuring out popularity, looking at whether other kids in their classroom give them a positive, a negative, or a neutral um, kind of evaluation. A controversial kid would be someone who got lots of positive, but also lots of negative. A neglected kid would get lots of neutral, and a rejected kid would get lots of negative. So even kids that were either controversial, neglected, or rejected were more okay with their social status and their popularity, so long as they had a best friend. So there's something about having at least one close friend, which seems to be particularly important in childhood. Selman gave us a stage model for friendship. This has been critiqued, but still remains one of the few kind of models out there that many still point to. Um, 5 to 7, this is early middle childhood. We see friendships as being very temporary and superficial. Kids aren't able to choose a lot of what they're doing, so their friends are who they hang out with, and they don't have a whole lot of choice about who those are. Um, 8 to 10, kids are starting to share more, and it becomes a more of a give and take relationship. They expect more from friends. They talk about choosing friends who are similar to them, and in fact, tend to have close friends that are similar in personality to them. From 11 through adults, someone talked about having more kind of emotional connection to these two friends, and being able to share thoughts and feelings. So, sharing a lot more even than in childhood. And then also knowing both the strengths and the weaknesses of your friends. So, being able to talk about what they were working on or what they were good at, as well as what they needed to improve. Silman also argued that trust is a defining feature of these friendships, and that across our lives, friendships become more selective. Um, this fits with other theories we'll talk about in older age, when as we start to um, get older, we tend to have a smaller social circle, and yet we rate those connections that we do have as more important and more close. So a lot of our friendships remain stable across middle childhood, in kids where moving or other things are not impeding that. So again, the research suggests that kids with friends are more socially competent, confident, and less lonely, and kids who are more troubled tend to be friendless. The issue here is that, well, there are a couple of issues. So one, um, often the studies have looked at friends, but we haven't looked at the quality of friends. So we've mostly looked at quantity of friends. Um, and it's not really clear about the direction of effect here. So is it that kids are troubled because they don't have friends, or do they not have friends because they are troubled? The other thing is that there's not a whole lot of longitudinal studies of friendship across childhood, so there's still room for growth in the field in this regard. Okay, we're talking more about friends and social development in this age, because in middle childhood, kids are starting to spend more time outside of their immediate family settings, more time at school and after school activities. So they are often less supervised in these activities. So just a change, as you can see, 24-hour graph, what kids are doing and how much of that time is where across the lifespan. So 40% of kids' day of their waking hours is with peers. This is twice as much as for in preschool. We're also more able to have kind of complex and sharing interactions with peers in middle childhood than we were in preschool. In preschool, there's a lot of collective monologue, and we're in the same place doing similar things, but the real dialectic and feeding off of each other and taking turns is not as common or as long lasting or as much of the time as in middle childhood. So when kids are hanging out with peers and not as closely supervised by adults, we ask them what they do. They will say games or doing nothing, hanging out, right? Some things about this peer-led or peer-focused time. Often they're learning conflict and negotiation. They're learning to compromise. They're learning to discuss things, how to talk through things. Unfortunately, sometimes the stronger, either personality-wise or physically, gets their wish because this is how the peers organize it. So less egalitarian. Um, yes, more of the time that kids are spending in these peer focused contexts is watching TV or playing games. And that's all we have. I thought I had more. Okay.